This video is going to be a little bit different. We're going to have a bit of a heart-to-heart because there's already quite a lot of articles, resources, and think pieces online about what happened during the negotiations and why things are the way that they are. So this video is not going to be about that. Instead, I'll be sharing more about the experiences, the things that I've seen, thought, and felt during my time there. I wrote a short summary of my opinions in the Straits Times the week immediately after I got back to Singapore. This was when things were a little bit fresh, and if you want a shorter TLDR, you can go and check that out. But this video is meant to give a little bit more context to some of the observations that I made in that article and to really expand on the points I didn't really talk much back then. This was actually a question I got quite a lot. Why are you going all the way to the other end of the world to sit in a conference room? Well, while our domestic biodiversity policies dealing with local conservation and management of natural spaces are relatively strong, our approaches to international biodiversity policy is quite weak by comparison, which is odd, especially when you consider how big of a player Singapore is in the climate space. Climate issues have been talked about on a much larger scale much more frequently, as the impacts of climate change are more clearly defined and loom much larger in our minds. Rising sea temperatures and rising sea levels, all of that, these are drilled into every single kid at school, and they've become a whole of government issue to tackle. National security problem. Biodiversity though, it's often seen as something that's good to have. Yes, it's important to fight for endangered animals. Keeping our forests alive also helps in the fight against climate change. But that hardly warrants a whole of government approach, right? Wrong. Whether you realize it or not, much of society is built upon and relies on the healthy functioning of ecosystems. Enjoying that bucket of durian for supper? Well, you have bats to thank. Almost all durian flowers are pollinated by bats. Love tequila, but maybe a little bit too much? Well, you also have bats to thank for that. Fisheries, grain, organic produce, pretty much everything we eat relies on ecosystems to some degree for services like water provision or pest control. Furniture, paper, building materials, all of these are sourced from timber, and many cosmetic products use palm oil. Everywhere you look in modern society, a little bit of every ecosystem can be found in our midst. The World Economic Forum estimates about half of the world's GDP, so a whopping $44 trillion annually, is dependent on ecosystem services and is therefore exposed to significant risks. This means that if we lose our habitats, things are going to become much more expensive. Acknowledging these, conversations in recent years at the CBD level have diversified quite a bit from talking about just conservation issues to diverse agenda items on synthetic biology, healthcare, technology, climate mitigation and adaptation, infrastructure, engineering, finance, data management, education, food sustainability, and lots of other things. However, Singapore's negotiation team at COP is mainly represented by NParks. Other ministries and the expertise are still missing from the biodiversity space. While that may have been sufficient in the past, it won't be for much longer. Biodiversity policy is growing and fast. Many stakeholders are coming over from the climate space keen to make a change for better or for worse. And it's important for us to be actively at the table, understanding how the global landscape is changing, and possibly even taking an active role in shaping these conversations. That's why I went to COP16. You don't hear much about it locally, but that needs to change. The biodiversity that matters to us as Singaporeans isn't just limited to our national boundaries, it goes far beyond that, and we have an obligation to ensure these global ecosystem services are not lost, if nothing else but for our own survival. Often in the news, you hear about negotiations stalling or proceeding very slowly. Of course, as the negotiations were the main event, I got to sit in and observe for some of the sessions. I helped to track some of the negotiations for particular agenda items on behalf of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, also known as GYBN. Most of the rooms were actually open for us to attend, although some had limitations on photography and recording. So I think for the vlog that we filmed, I didn't really have much footage on that. Prior to the COP16, GYBN actually released a youth position paper on most of the agenda items. However, as GYBN is an observer organisation under the CBD, our positions cannot be reflected in the official text of the COP without the endorsement of a party to the convention. So our role while we were there was to track down negotiations, literally note down what was being said and who was saying it. The idea is that parties with similar views to our youth positions could be approached outside of negotiation time and be persuaded to endorse our views during the follow-up negotiation sessions. So it was through doing all of this that I got to observe some of the behind-the-scenes action. The COP itself operates on a consensus basis, meaning that everyone must agree to the official text that's being negotiated. We literally go line by line to ensure that there's minimal disagreement. And while at first this seems like overkill, some of these disagreements were really quite pedantic, like countries squabbling over whether a full stop or a comma is more grammatically correct. You guys are at COP, surely there are bigger problems to tackle than this, right? But after a while, you do get to sort of have an appreciation for why negotiations often move so slowly. Changing just one word of the text can have significant implications. For example, could versus should. Could is more of a suggestion or recommendation and is generally considered weaker language compared to should, which is stronger language that conveys an obligation or requirement. In the second week of negotiations, discussions became much more heated and much more focused, moving away from the more pedantic disagreements and focusing more on finding common ground. The chairs who were mediating these negotiations had quite the uphill task, and it was quite funny. The phrase "in the spirit of compromise" has been completely ruined for me. If I had $1 for every time I heard it, I'd be a billionaire. On that note, finance, of course, was the one divisive topic that couldn't reach any agreement at all. Tale as old as time, on one hand, you have developing countries pushing for stronger language, which would translate to greater expected funding obligations for developed countries. On the other hand, you have developed countries requesting for greater flexibility and more hedging and ambiguity in the text, basically weaker language. More interesting is actually seeing the specific players on either side of the argument and the individual stances that each party sort of takes. Observing the dynamics between the parties after a while, you can sort of see where the mutual stances within each negotiating bloc align, allowing for alliances between parties for specific agenda items. So side events, they're not quite what the name implies. In fact, for many of the delegates, the side events were the main attraction. The negotiations, they can get quite heated or even juicy at times, especially if it's an agenda item you're tracking, or if you're planning to lobby parties on particular issues. But other than that, the vast majority of attendees at COP seem to be there for the side events, to network, to peddle their services, like if you're a consultant or a techie, to protest, a couple of them for indigenous rights or against things like offsetting, or even to raise awareness about particular topics, like the importance of underground mycorrhizal networks. I spent a lot more time in side events as well because I wanted to learn more about how the global biodiversity framework was implemented in other countries. I also wanted to see what kind of arguments were being used to garner support for these concepts. They were quite new to me, and I assume for most Singaporeans as well, such as for conservation finance. Why is it relevant to the private sector or central banks? If these are investors or philanthropists, what are their priorities and concerns? And do they communicate with and align with the expectations of civil society? All of these things. So in order to do this, I tried to cover a very wide range of side events, and I suppose I got what I asked for, and a lot more. It comes as little surprise, I guess, that there is a ton of siloing in the conversations during the side events. So civil society hosted events tend to be attended just by civil society, and likewise for events hosted by the private sector. And there is some representation from both sides for things like panel discussions, but especially for the private sector-led events, these tended to be quite tokenistic in terms of representation. The civil society rep was often just there for diversity of opinion, if I'm being very honest, and these were the vast majority of side events. The few side events hosted by civil society, at least the ones that I ended up attending, seemed to try and compensate for this lack of representation by taking extremely aggressive, hardline stances on these issues, which from what I saw and from what I heard after the sessions, did end up alienating a couple of the private sector reps in the audience who were perhaps a bit more moderate in their views and may have been more open to novel ideas on civil engagement. Overall, being stuck in the middle was an interesting position to be in. On one hand, I was representing civil society, as a youth group and regularly interacting with these people firsthand. I was very taken with their own personal stories, dealing with and struggling with land grabbing, slimy corporates trying to take advantage of their communities and livelihoods with their get-rich-quick schemes. On the other hand, I could sort of see what the private sector, the other side, was onto. I don't agree with all of it, some of it was poorly informed pseudoscience, while others were straight up greenwashing and making extremely unscientific claims on how to account entire ecosystems using just cheap and readily available environmental satellite data. This video is long enough, and I'm not going to get into details about that, but biodiversity accounting and accurately trying to assign quantifiable values to ecosystems was a big part of many discussions there. And broadly, a lot of consultancies seem to focus on very cheap, very quick methods of habitat valuation that were broadly applicable across many different countries and ecosystems. While simple and cost-effective, these methods often did miss a lot of the distinctive characteristics and values unique to each ecosystem, which is civil society's major critique. But I guess, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but after working with the Singapore government for so long, the inner pragmatic sensibilities and the need for concrete steps forward in line with national agendas whenever we make policy recommendations, for example, it kind of really forced me to sit and evaluate what a comfortable middle ground would look like. What kind of system is civil society at large comfortable with that keeps operational and administrative costs reasonably low, such that the private sector is not too grumpy about it? I still don't have an answer. We're working on something now to try and suggest possible options in SYBD, but until there is some common ground on the issue between civil society and private sector, in the spirit of compromise, I'm not sure if anything meaningful will come of it. And I should add that it's not just finance that faces these issues. It's the most prominent and talked about one for sure. But almost all the other agenda items carry similar undertones regarding the diverse values of biodiversity and how different stakeholders view the stewardship or use of biodiversity differently. Health, genetic resources, access to ecosystem services, scientific knowledge, technological expertise, you name it, those issues are there. It's all very deeply intertwined, and it took me some time to really sit and understand all of the interlinkages, especially because we don't talk about these issues at all in Singapore. It's my first time hearing about things like compensation for use of genetic resources derived from biodiversity in pharmaceutical products. That's a lot, right? But basically, if a company rakes in massive profits annually from drugs derived from plants or using traditional indigenous knowledge, the communities that provided that knowledge or who are protecting those habitats should be fairly compensated. But our view of biodiversity in Singapore is so one-dimensional and limited to, wow, I love the greenery, the fresh air, pretty butterflies. We don't see this whole world of policy and decision-making that has existed for so long, that ties so many industries and branches of policy, science, and economics together. And that's one of the things that really, really needs to change. So I think there is one line that really summarizes everything overall really, really well. It's from our favorite content creator, BioGirl MJ, who was sharing about her time at the Climate COP. And she said something like, wow, the world is really, really so big. And I really, really think that's quite true. You read online about these negotiations happening in some far-off land, people squabbling about their own agendas, and you lament the state of the universe. But when you're there, you're actually talking to the people on the ground, to the negotiators who are actively trying to balance different stakeholder interests. You're talking to indigenous communities fighting for their land rights, to women, to youths, consultants, academics, even businesses. Hearing from them directly really drove home how these are real people faced with real problems, and they're all kind of just trying their best. That's not to say that everyone there was completely pure of heart, pure of intention. More on that a bit later. But really getting to meet and to know more about these people and hearing their stories firsthand, you sort of start to see how even within one group, their perspectives can diverge really quite significantly. The world really is that big. So as you can probably tell, there's a lot to talk about. And when I first decided that I was going to do this video, I was like, easy, right? But finally sitting down and really writing all the talking points down, organizing them, there's a lot more stuff that I really, really want to talk about, like conversations about synergies between biodiversity and climate policies, or the role that Singapore civil society should be playing in these international policy negotiations for biodiversity. But those are really just the beginning for future work on this topic here in Singapore. I could make entire half-hour videos just dedicated to those topics and what was being talked about at COP, because there's just so much potential and room for discussion. And that's the thing about biodiversity policy, right? Like, currently, it's no man's land. I can say whatever I want because there is no frame of reference. There's no existing baselines for policy making, and I can be as creative or as ambitious as I like because I'm shaping these conversations at a very early stage. But at the end of the day, I am just one person. Even SYVV as a whole is just one youth group. And we're not the only ones with an interest in the CBD. There's plenty of other people out there waiting for the right opportunity. And some of them may not have the best intentions in mind. I certainly saw a lot of that already myself at COP. So policy is no longer just an option or a side thing for nature and conservation. It's something that we need to start talking about, and fast. It's no longer just a science issue, it's a social issue, policy issue, economic issue, engineering issue, infrastructural issue, food security issue, a logistic issue. Whatever the industry, chances are your work does involve biodiversity on some level. And the sooner we start talking about these diverse uses of and impacts to biodiversity worldwide, the better our chances are of finding more effective solutions for protecting it in the long run. So if you made it to the end of the video, thanks so much for watching. Please leave a comment saying I'm here so that I know that you finished this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you made it to the end of the video, I know it's been a very long series, but thank you for coming along with me on this journey as we went to Cali, Colombia and back, and really sharing in all of the thoughts and discussions. We are really open to having more conversations about this, so if you're interested to learn more about biodiversity policy and how it can be implemented in Singapore, please check out our social media page, like and subscribe, share this video to people you think will be interested to learn more about biodiversity policy, and we'll see you next time.